Cultic's the kind of game that really makes me realise that there's just not enough hours in the day anymore. Originally coming out in early access on Steam in October last year, it's only now, like a few months later, that I finally had time to sit down and play through the whole thing and do a video on it. In a genre that's long since become kinda samey and repetitive, Cultic does at least do its best at trying to differentiate itself from the pack, even managing to be picked up and published by 3D Realms. Now, Steam describes this thing as an old school inspired first person shooter, and yeah, on the surface it certainly plays like one. At the moment you can play through the entire first chapter, which will probably take anywhere from 4 to 5 hours to get through, depending on how much time you want to spend going back and checking out all the secrets. And fans of shooters are going to be able to easily pick up what Cultic is putting down and get right into it, which is probably why it's sitting on an overwhelmingly positive rating on Steam, which is something you just don't see all that much anymore. I've even seen a lot of people comparing this thing to Blood, people too who are pretty solidified within the FPS scene, and yeah, look, it definitely has its similarities, mostly in the fact, I guess, that you're shooting cultists with a sawn-off shotgun or blowing them up with bundles of dynamite. These cultists also use the same weapons as the player and throw their own dynamite bundles as well, so yeah, there's definitely grounds for a bit of a base comparison there. The basic story setup is that you're playing as like a private detective or something who's heading to this mysterious remote village to investigate a series of missing person cases, only to be ambushed by this cult and then left for dead. Then the whole thing opens with you awakening from this pile of corpses and seeking out revenge. But apart from the whole coming back from the dead thing, I mean, that's about where it stops. There's no constant one-liners referencing pop culture. There's no supernatural weapons like voodoo dolls or the life leech. There's no akimbo mode, there's no power-ups, and the game is very bare bones when it comes to jokes and levity. Not in a bad way, it's just Cultic is really trying to go for a much more serious tone. When I think of Blood's level design, I mostly think of it being at medium to close range, combat inside lots of rooms with corners and doorways where you can break line of sight, and avoid all those enemies with their marksmanship accuracy. In Cultic though, you spend most of the time in these larger opened up areas outside and shooting at someone who's like 100 meters away. So comparing the two in that regard is like saying that paintball is the same as skeet shooting.
Silence!
Now that's not to downplay Blood's quality, and especially not Cultic's, but I think the comparisons people can make here are face value at best, and it really doesn't go much further than that.
Piss!
What I think it does achieve though is making you feel like some poor asshole stuck out in the middle of a forest, smack bang in the middle of nowhere surrounded by murderous psychopaths. And on that note, I think what it easily takes more reference from is survival horror, particularly Resident Evil 4.
No thanks, bro.
Now this is something I've been saying for months since I played this back in early access, and the developer all but confirmed it that that's the primary influence. I mean, let's look at the evidence. The premise of trying to find a missing person in some remote village is kind of a bit similar to Leon's extended vacation in Spain and his mission to find Ashley.
I was wondering if you might recognize the girl in this photograph.
A succulent Chinese meal.
Remember Ashley, that young ballistic-equipped woman who has a scream like a pregnant dolphin?
How rude!
Most of the levels take place with a bush backdrop. I'm sure there's a your mum joke there, where you have to look out for bear traps and explosive tripwires hidden amongst the environment. And although you start off with not much more than a zipper lighter as a light source, you eventually get a flashlight which hangs off your shirt like it's something out of Silent Hill. Enemies are decked out head to toe in robes, and they often throw axes, along with having certain enemy varieties that wield full body shields. You even fight suits of armor that have come back to life to start attacking you. You've got a Mauser pistol, which, let's be honest, is identical to the Red 9 that Leon uses, and when you reload this thing, you can see that your character is wearing a coat that's got a woolen lining. Again, kind of similar to Leon's drip when he first gets to the village.
Sorry to have bothered you.
How about the fact that ammo and medkit drops are randomly generated? There's even an upgrade system which is expensive on resources, and about all that's missing there is like a mysterious merchant, who happens to always know where you are and be waiting around every corner to try to sell you some shit.
Thank you.
But don't worry, because there's an achievement that's a direct reference to this guy in the survival mode. Yeah, survival mode, you know, more or less mercenaries.
Thank you.
Plus too, I mean, Cultic just has some really well done horror sequences. Like in this bit, for instance, you're moving through a pitch black cave that's got a bunch of corpses hanging from the ceiling. Soon enough, these things come to life before a guy wearing a bag over his head wielding a chainsaw bursts through the nearby wall to try to kill you. Now look, there ain't a single enemy in a Blood game that's got a chainsaw, but I can sure think of a fair few that use them in the Resident Evil games. And even the music during this whole sequence sounds very familiar. I also got vibes of Italian horror from some of this stuff. The sight of those corpses in bags all tied up with rope reminds me of Lucio Fulci films. And the visual of these rotting undead guys wearing armor and having hooded robes is kind of reminiscent of the tombs of the blind dead. Even a simple thing like the typewriter props you come across frequently look very similar to those iconic save spots. The only thing they're missing is a New Game Plus mode where you can replay the game with all your upgrades to max everything out, but maybe that'll come in the future. So ultimately, yes, you can compare this whole thing to Blood if you really want to, and yes, it does have those superficial similarities, but it's like saying that Casablanca is the same as Goodfellas, because they're both shot on film. So if you're one of those people going into this thing expecting a particular kind of game or a spiritual sequel, only to then complain or criticize about the lack of things like one-liners or impact explosive dynamite, well, gotta tell you, man, that's on you. Alright, so now that we got past all of that shit, it's still worth noting here that what's left is a pretty damn fun little shooter. Depending on the difficulty mode you go with, assuming of course you're playing on anything above normal, your character often feels as fragile as a water balloon in a knitting needle factory. And there's much more of an emphasis on aiming for weak spots as opposed to just running and gunning. Healing and ammo supplies are also kinda limited, putting an emphasis on making all of your shots count. Cultic also makes sure that you really know when you hit someone where it hurts, with these awesome looking slow motion effects highlighting that one bad guy's gory demise. So precise aim and slow movement is really what gets rewarded here, as opposed to running around like Duke Nukem when he's hopped up on steroids. And when I really started to actually progress in the game without staring at that game over screen every 5 seconds was when I started to approach it this way.
Come on, we just want to eat your skin.
And yeah, again, it kind of plays a little bit different to a certain other old school shooter featuring a cynical, bald-headed gunslinger, doesn't it? Anyway, as for the weapons, there's a fair few on offer here, and as you'd expect, they have advantages and disadvantages depending on the situations. You start the game with an axe, which ain't all that useful, but thankfully not too long after that, you get the pistol. And get ready to spend the majority of the game using this thing, because once you upgrade the accuracy, it turns it into a goddamn rifle, and can even be used to take out enemies at long range. Plus you'll be drowning in ammo more than Andrew Tate is drowning in legal fees. Shortly after that, you'll find the lever action rifle, which does great damage, but doesn't have any kind of zoom mode, forcing you to shoot from the hip. What it does have though is armor piercing abilities, which comes in really handy against those guys with shields. Plus it also comes with the sad reminder that we just don't get enough lever action weapons in video games. I mean, look man, I've been obsessed with lever action guns since I was a little kid. Back when I saw Arnie pull one of those things out and shoot at Robert Patrick in a shopping mall, and I left Cultic only wanting that even more. After that, there's a sawn-off shotgun, which is one of the few reasons this game's been tirelessly compared to Blood. Unlike Blood Shotgun though, with this thing you've really got to be close enough to an enemy to smell their breath for it to be effective. And considering the vastness of a lot of Cultic's environments, that's not always going to be your best option, which meant that most of the time I just opted to use something else. Still though, if some gangster is dissing your fly girl, you just give him one of these.
Ooh, hey, ooh.
At this point, you've no doubt got a few dynamite bundles and Molotov cocktails, and I do actually kind of like the way that these have been implemented. Because aside from just equipping these individually, you can also quick throw an unlit dynamite bundle out there, then wait for enemies to walk past it and shoot it for a quick and cheap kill. Surprisingly too, enemies might even kick these things away instead of just walking right over them, which is a neat touch, considering that in most of these kind of throwback games, explosives falling at the enemy's feet may as well be invisible. I think the only other game that I've ever seen the AI kick back grenades was Medal of Honor back in 1999, so does that mean that now Cultic's also a spiritual sequel to the Medal of Honor games? Later on, you'll get the Sten submachine gun, which has the same ammo as the pistol, but I'm kind of inclined to say that I think the pistol is better here, only because you conserve much more ammo if you use the pistol and try to limit yourself to headshots, and the spray and pray nature of the Sten just doesn't quite lend itself to that same concept. Still though, the Sten is a lot of fun to use, and it shows off that glorious chunky pixel art. Another underrated FPS weapon they've got here is the flamethrower, and the only problem that Cultic has with this is that they don't let you use this thing sooner. And the sound that the enemies make when you hit them up with this thing kind of sounds like an elder god trying to pass a kidney stone. And of course, what would a first-person shooter be without a rocket launcher / grenade launcher? I've got to say that I think there's genuinely few things in life that are as good as firing a grenade launcher into a cluster of enemies in a video game and watching them all just get completely fucking deatomized.
Thank you.
Cultic's even got this whole boss fight against a tank outside a church where you've got to destroy this thing with a grenade launcher, and it is a definite highlight of the entire campaign. And then finally, there's the FG42, though not as you'd probably expect it to be, because it's more or less just like a better version of the lever-action rifle with the bonus of having a sniper scope and doing a bit more damage, making it great for quick headshots. And I'm still yet to come across a single game that has an FG42 that I haven't liked. From the one in Return to Castle Wolfenstein through to the one in Call of Duty World at War, there's just something about this gun that just always tickles me right in my special place. Talking about my dick. You'll really need to put all of this arsenal to good use because enemies are also able to wield a lot of these weapons, making it a real sense of getting a taste of your own blood-soaked medicine at times. Most of the weapons in this game aren't hit scanning, thank God, so shooting from a safe distance is really much better than trying to engage enemies at close range. But still, this game does not fuck around, and you'll be handed out a fair few slices of humble pie, let me tell you. I found that a lot of the time you can just pop enemies off in the distance when they're none the wiser, because until an enemy is aware of the player, they'll often just stand there doing nothing. And it is kind of easy to take their head off from a distance with even a weapon like the pistol. Still though, you will die here a lot. In fact, playing on very hard and extreme difficulty, it's more like you're playing a tactical shooter instead of a boomer shooter. God, I hate that term. And there's just simply no sane reason to play aggressively because enemy damage and the accuracy is just tuned up to the point that they just annihilate you. It can really polarize the kind of experience you have level to level here, depending on the size of the environment and where enemies are placed within it. Not to mention your experience is going to differ greatly depending on the difficulty mode you've gone with, to the point that you start approaching it as an entirely different game. In fact, the selection menu even outright says that hard mode is designed for people who are familiar with Cultic's mechanics. So at that point, it's as much about skill as it is just familiarity. Now, the main critique I have with Cultic kind of boils down to some iffy hit detection.
Bullshit!
Or the amount of times I'd get killed when I was in cover because the ground in front of me didn't realize it was supposed to be simulating a solid object, and it just let those bullets go right through and hit me. While most of the enemies do feel balanced, zombies have like this weird leaping animation where they lock onto you and it's almost impossible to get past them without taking damage. Kind of doubly weird too, considering how slowly they're normally moving. And then when you just happen to walk past them, they suddenly get springs in their shoes and can leap forward like Inspector Gadget if he ever had a lightning bolt shot up his ass.
Motherfucker, give me a dick!
That slow motion effect you get every now and then when you kill an enemy does look cool, but it can often also be slightly confusing, because in other games when you get a mechanic like this, it often only happens when you've killed the last enemy in the nearby group. I did a video on Deadlink a while back, and this I think is a good comparison to make, because in that game, that slow motion effect was like an announcement to let you know the area was clear of threats. You know, so you could resume breathing normally, wipe the sweat off your face and balls, and collect yourself for the next room. But even further back than that, to something like Max Payne, that game used to do the same thing, and it felt like a bit of a reward for surviving another encounter. But here in Cultic, it doesn't seem to mean jack shit, and even after you get it, like a bunch of enemies could still be waiting around the next corner. It just kind of seems like something thrown in more for style than communicating information to the player. Cultic is definitely also a unique game visually, there's no arguments there, but I do think also that there's a bit of lack of visual variety, especially when it comes to the color palette. And yes, look, I know it's an old school shooter, but I don't really remember that many shooters from back then being comprised of only 4 colors. There are options there to fine-tune how the whole thing looks, which does help, but you still can't really change around an entire game's art style at the end of the day. Doesn't help either that you're really just exploring the same looking kind of areas over and over, like forests and abandoned buildings, more forest before mines, underground crypts, more forest, and then excavation sites. I mean, yeah, it is kind of unique, but it does seem a bit drab at times. I guess I'm just kind of hoping there's going to be more variety in the upcoming chapters. Still though, one thing I will admit, this game has some absolutely gorgeous skyboxes.
Wow.
More of a personal pet peeve for me too is how long some of these levels go on for, and I just don't know when it started to be the case that all these indie shooters had to have these really intricate levels. I mean, you all remember the first level of Doom, right? You could finish that in a couple of minutes. First level of Quake, yeah, you know, same thing. First level of Duke Nukem 3D, well, okay, that one had a bit more going on, but you wouldn't spend more than 15 or 20 minutes there tops. Even if we want to go back to the game that kicked off this whole retro FPS revival with Dusk, same thing, man, that first level, 5 or 10 minutes tops. In comparison, I think the first level in Cultic probably took me maybe 45 minutes to an hour to get through. First level in Cultic starts with you finding a way to like a nearby police station or something. Then after you've cleared that out, you're in like this opened up forest area, moving ahead and clearing out a bunch of enemy patrols. Assuming you explore everything at this point, you know, this will probably take anywhere from 10 to 15 minutes. Then after that, you head inside a mine shaft and start exploring the surrounding caverns, as well as having to engage in multiple gunfights. After making your way through some of these, the level kind of slows down a bit, and then throws you into that corpse-infested dungeon with that dollar store Dr. Salvador to deal with. After that, you've got a few more shootouts before you've then finally looped back to the start of the level where you first entered the mines, and can now get through a locked gate to find the level exit. What I think it affects too is how it kind of makes secret hunting a bit of a chore. It just kind of made me less inclined to walk over every single pixel to try to find that hidden door or switch. And I don't think that that's a silly critique to make either. I mean, the guys working on Project Warlock 2 literally went back and broke down that first episode into smaller chunks for similar reasons. That's why Doom's Knee Deep in the Dead's always going to be the single greatest episode of any FPS game to me. I mean, you've got 8 tightly crafted and honed levels. I mean, 9 if you count the secret level, which can all be beaten in progressively longer times, without ever being complex to the point that going back through them, secret hunting felt like trying to find a needle in a haystack. Still though, for a game largely made by one person, it feels kind of pointless to really cut all that deep here with Cultic, and I still think that the more I play it, the more I keep enjoying it. We're really living in an age now where some of the best games that are coming out are indie games that are made by dev teams that could fit in a broom closet. In the case of Cultic, it's primarily made by one guy, and that's really kind of impressive what he's pulled off here. I know Chapter 2 is planned to be released in the future, and yeah, maybe later on there'll be way more supernatural elements and other gameplay features added in, so people on YouTube can finally validate comparing this thing to Blood. Either way though, just on its own, Cultic offers up some satisfyingly chunky pixelated violence, where every kill and explosion sounds like someone dropping a watermelon down an empty stairwell. And you know what, at the end of the day, that kind of thing's hard to fault.
You know, you must die.